Such is the way of the world, you can never know just where to put all your faith, and how will it grow? Gonna rise up, burning black holes and dark memories. Gonna rise up, turn mistakes into gold.
Listening to Eddie Vedder, and that is the End of the Wild soundtrack. I would suggest you listen to it. Free on YouTube. We're talking today about chapter 17. And 17 only. Lots of stuff going on in here also. So, starting on the very beginning, it's important to know that there's a huge quote here from guess who? It's like going open the Bible and go, there's Jesus again talking. Henry David Thoreau. And it's from Mount Katahdin, right? In that unique spelling, K-T-A-A-D-N, Katahdin. It's in Maine. And we're going to learn a little bit about Thoreau and Katahdin. You can look it up. It is about a 4,500, 5,000 foot mountain in Maine, which by today's standards, not big deal. I've climbed mountains that are 65 and 10 and 14, so it's not a terrible one, but in the middle of the 1800s, it was in the middle of nowhere, all right? And actually, still today, Maine is pretty much middle of the nowhere. So it's an interesting piece because even Thoreau, and remember, Thoreau spent 2 years living in the woods at Emerson's Land and Lake. So it's not like he's out there. If he ever got hungry or cold, he could walk a mile to town. So he's not in the wild. But he felt the need to do it, and he went to Katahdin to do it. And if you take a look at this passage, he talks about just, there was no man's garden, but the hand-shelled world. Word I've never seen before. And it's just that there's parts of this planet that man probably isn't supposed to be. And this is a guy who loved nature. He acknowledges there's places on earth that man is completely at the mercy of nature. He's very humble to that. And that humble nature of Thoreau is in juxtaposition to the fact that Chris McCandless lacks a bit of humility in front of nature. And that lack of humility is his hubris. And his hubris can be said to have gotten him killed. And we're going to look at that today. John Krakauer is there to follow up and go to the bus. The bus, by the way, which is a pilgrimage place for many. Not as many as that go to Thoreau, because there's a park around Thoreau's cabin and a highway that leads to it. And it's about the same distance from Boston, Massachusetts as Fairfield is from Cincinnati. So many people have been there, myself included. But I've not been to the bus. And, you know, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't try it. But the thing here is Krakauer is there with a topographical map. And Chris McCandless refused to go into the wild with a map. He wanted to be, you know, completely living off the land out there without a map. And anybody that you talk to that is into hiking or exploring or living in the woods will tell you what a stupid idea this is, especially in Alaska. And it wouldn't have ruined it, but he was a bit naive. It wouldn't have made him a coward to have a map. It just meant he would know how to get out of there. And had he had that topographical map, he knew, as you guys read in the book, he would have found the places that, the cabins that were very near, 4 miles in one direction, and got himself out of there. So this is Chris's hubris, which cost him dearly. And again, one of the reasons why he wants to do that is McCandless wants to go to terra incognita, or unknown territory or unknown land. And I will say that this is something man has been doing since the dawn of time, and we're doing it right now if you pay attention, but most of us are too busy watching the White Claw lady on Instagram and TikTok to pay attention. Man does not like to be told he can't go here because we haven't been there yet. So, though we've pretty much gone all over the planet, with small exceptions, the bottom of the sea that we're looking at here and there, we are putting foot on Mars right now. And it's not very sexy because we're using rovers, but if you know anything about technology, it's pretty sexy. But mapping, finishing the mapping of the world was something the British took great pride in at the end of, towards the height of their empire, in the Edwardian age of heroism between 1900 and basically 1910, when they were shoving off all over the planet, and then again in 1920 after World War I. But this going into terra incognita, George Mallory, the first guy that went to Mount Everest, the British, a guy named Everest, figured out that it was the tallest. Actually, he didn't, an Indian did. He figured out it was the tallest, but the British wouldn't name it after the Indian who figured it out. Naturally, they named it after Everest, who didn't want it named after him. But anyway, they sent immediately an expedition to try to get an Englishman to the top of it to say, we've been there. The South Pole, the North Pole, Lewis and Clark, all of these guys. It's been since the dawn of time. Some man has said, you know what, what's over there? And quite a few, maybe in the cave, are like, I don't know, it's very scary over there. But somebody was willing to go do it. And going out there and that feeling that you're somewhere in the wild is a driving force in man. It is and you know, George Mallory, who ultimately died on Everest, and Shackleton, who died going to Antarctica, Robert Falcon Scott, who froze to death in Antarctica. All these guys were doing this. They're going to these places that, and they had maps, by the way, and they still died. It's a drive personally and independently, but then it also becomes a national thing. And if you think about it, many Americans will say today, an American will say, we put a man on the moon, right? Well, that man was put on the moon before probably the person said it was born, and he had nothing to do with it, or she had nothing to do with it anyway. But it feels like we did, because man did it. And Armstrong and NASA and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, those guys all represent all of us. So when they do that, it feels like a personal achievement. And then there are things that we do, you know, from bungee jump to backpacking to, you know, to something to just say, you know, I stepped out of my comfort zone. Mallory started that way and ended up frozen to death on Everest that way. On 178, and this is some commentary that I saw, there's a lot of effort by John Krakauer to defend Chris McCandless. And there are questions as to why. It's a good question. The first thing here is that he goes and points out the fact that Chris McCandless actually did shoot a moose and not a caribou, and chastised those who criticized him and said that he was an idiot. He couldn't even tell the one from the other, and therefore, you know, made the assertion that he probably was untrained and unknowing and deserved to die. And Krakauer is very, very adamant about pointing. He says McCandless shot exactly what he said he shot. And the boy may have made some mistakes on the Stampede Trail, but confusing a caribou with a moose was not one of them. One of the questions I saw in the emails is why? Why so much? Why to defend him? Well, first of all, as the book already shows you, Krakauer and Chris McCandless are kindred spirits. That's what Krakauer is trying to tell you. He says, I did some of the things this kid did. I did dumber things than this kid did. And I didn't get killed, and I could have easily been killed. I also had a bad relationship with my parents. I also regret what I've done with my parents. My dad also was a jerk. You know, all this. He understands him, and it's one of the reasons. Personally, I can get into this is because I have a sort of the kindred spirit with Thoreau and also the rest of these guys. And so it's palpable. A lot of the questions that I get questioning what's going on are from the female students, which is interesting. They, um, and again, throughout history, I mean, there's plenty of female explorers, don't get me wrong, but for every female explorer, there's probably 10,000 men, and some of it is bravado of the past and women couldn't go, but some of it is just, there's some genetics going on here of women being a little smarter than men when it comes to certain aspects, not feeling that need to, you know, do things to prove their manliness. Okay, sometimes it's a joke, but there is probably, according to the Nat Geo I read, some science behind it also that I'll get into in a moment. But of course, in our own modern culture, we're very cautious, which is fine, of saying there is this kind of difference between men and women. There are adventurous women. I mean, Jane Goodall, one of these women, it was very admirable in her work, and she's not the only one. Her pioneer work with chimps, and I've read, there's in National Geographic this month about pioneering, enterprising, adventurous women, you know, and so there's plenty of cases of it, but like I said, for every dead woman out there, there's like Amelia Earhart, there's probably 1,000 men, because they run off. In the Grand Canyon, when I've been to the bottom of the Grand Canyon 3 times, and they stop. They don't stop the women, they don't stop the old people. They stop the guys that are 25 to 40 and say, you are the most likely to die here, because your arrogance and hubris are the things that push you on. Elderly people, women tend to go, you know what, I don't feel so well, I'm going back. And men are like, nah, I'm gonna soldier through it. So this is the kind of thing, you know, there's a difference. 179, Alexander Supertramp, at the bottom of the first paragraph, says, all hail the phantom bear, the beast within. Interesting that he says the beast within. I once took a college class called The Beast Within, and we read Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein, Lord of the Flies, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and it was all about that dual nature of human, and how this sort of primal being burst out of, and not a surprise, all the main characters were men, but that's partly due to when they were written. Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, Lord of the Flies, and Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. But point is, this beast within is a common motif in literature. And right below that, again, we did this in the last video, the declaration by Chris McCandless of 2 years he walks the earth, no phone, no pool, no pets, no cigarettes, ultimate freedom, an extremist and aesthetic voyager whose home is the road. I sometimes get a little nostalgic when I'm riding around in my van, which is definitely not living in the wild, okay? Canned tuna and carrots by candlelight in the back of a van reading Thoreau is not exactly living in the wild, but it is kind of fun. On 180, 181, it's interesting they bring in Sir John Franklin, one of my less than heroes, though it should be a hero. He's a bit of a dullard, all indications of history, but he was the guy in charge, or put in charge, of finding the Northwest Passage from England straight over, up past Greenland, across the top of Canada. That was a lot faster than going around the South Pole. Remember, in the 1800s, there was no Panama Canal. There was also no Suez Canal. So this is a big deal. And this is the moonshot, right? This is the British moonshot. And if you're into explorers, this is fun to read about. But Sir John Franklin went on 3 expeditions. One a disaster with cannibalism. Another one that was kind of and then the third one that killed them all right? And they talk about his lack of humility. He went out with fine china, good clothes, you know, all the things that a Victorian gentleman would have. And turns out that's not what you need in Antarctica. His mistakes also paved the way for guys like Roald Olmsted and Sir Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton and all that come along about half a century later. But there's this whole thing about Sir John Franklin, whose body has never been found, and they just found his ship on the bottom of the ocean, which is very interesting. You can look up on National Geographic. I'm sure there's a video on YouTube, but they found it where it sunk. There was cannibalism and people frozen to death. They found some bodies, all that kind of stuff. probably pretty miserable. Way to go. But Krakauer is trying to tell you, this is hubris. He's classifying the mistake without the map as sort of a young boy's error. I don't know. I'm having a hard time forgiving him. Okay, but that's all personal preference, right? I mean, he did go out there with a book of what to eat off the land. It just seems if you could have the book, you could have a map. But I'm not gonna, pass judgment on that. If you go to 182, as we round out here, talks about this missing the point of the mistakes he made. Says it probably misses the point, though, to castigate. What a great word, castigate. McCandless for being ill-prepared. He was green, and he overestimated his resilience, but he was sufficiently skilled to last for 16 weeks on little more than his wits and 10 pounds of rice, and he was fully aware when he entered the bush that he had given himself a perilously slim margin of error. Okay? But it goes on to talk about it's hardly unusual for a young man to be drawn to a pursuit considered reckless by his elders. Engaging in risky behavior is a rite of passage in our culture no less than in most others. Dangerous has always held its allure. Okay? That's why many teenagers drive too fast, they drink too much, they take too many drugs. It's why it's been easy for nations to recruit young men to go to war. Okay? Youthful daring do, in fact, is an evolutionary adaptive behavior. Evolutionary. Car insurance companies figured it out years ago. You look at the rate of car crashes, and when you hit 25, it drops precipitously down. They didn't care why. That's why your insurance goes down at 25. National Geographic put out an article a few years ago about how the brain, the last thing that develops is your sense of sort of caution in your brain. And that makes total sense. Things that I would have done at 16, 18, and 22, I wouldn't even consider on my worst day today. And that is part of just growing up. And that hits at 25. You can almost feel it when you get that age. You'll realize that. When all of a sudden you're like, I think I'll sit in this Friday night and just sit in the backyard and relax. You wouldn't have done that when you were 24, 23, 22. No, you wouldn't have. Anyway, that's the point. And it's, as he says, this is important. He says it is a evolutionary adaptive behavior encoded in us, okay? So Chris is at right age to do something crazy and rash and think that I'm invincible, right? Most of us feel that way when we're younger, okay? And then he even talked about two guys who were pretty laid back, right? He talked about John Muir, the guy who founded the Sierra Club. He actually spent a night, this is on 182, 183, holding on for dear life at the top of a tree in a horrendous storm in the Sierra Nevada, right? Something he wouldn't have done when he was older. And then also, even stayed prissy Henry David Thoreau left the confines of Concord, Massachusetts. Sorry, you gotta go. And went to Katahdin, okay? And it says, unlike Muir and Thoreau, McCandless went into the wilderness not primarily to ponder nature or the world at large, but rather to explore the inner country of his soul. And we've already talked about how prophets do this. He soon discovered, however, that Muir and Thoreau already knew an extended stay in the wilderness inevitably directs one's attention outward as much as inward, and it is impossible to live off the land without developing both a subtle understanding of and a strong emotional bond with that land and all it holds. So, again, another attempt to show you that even the greats, even the icons, Thoreau and Muir, guys that we look upon as the steady guides of transcendentalism, even they did some wacky stuff when they were younger, stuff that could have gotten them killed. And finally, as we wrap up here on 184, 185, again, Krakauer is trying to defend Chris, and one of the reasons is when he wrote his initial argument, if you remember, in Outsider magazine, just about his body being found, people were virulently relentless on how much they scolded this guy, called him an idiot and everything else. And I think Krakauer's a little bothered that people could be so callous about another human being's lost life. So with that said, on 182, he says it would be right in the middle. It would be easy to stereotype Christopher McCandless as another boy who felt too much, a loopy young man who read too many books and lacked even a modicum of common sense. Modicum and paucity are the same, which is the opposite of plethora. But the stereotype isn't a good fit. McCandless wasn't some feckless slacker, adrift and confused, racked by existential despair. To the contrary, his life hummed with meaning and purpose. But the meaning he wrested from existence lay beyond the comfortable path. McCandless distrusted the value of things that came easily. He demanded much of himself, more in the end than he could deliver. And of course, one of the things that's obviously pushed him is that disconnect with his father, and his father's relationship was very trying. Trying to explain McCandless's unorthodox behavior, some people have made much of the fact that, like John Waterman, he was small in stature and may have suffered from a short man's complex, a fundamental insecurity that drove him to prove his manhood by means of extreme physical challenges. Others have posited that an unresolved Oedipal conflict was at the root of his fatal odyssey. Although there may be some truth in both hypotheses, this sort of, I love this, posthumous, off-the-rack psychoanalysis is the dubious, highly speculative enterprise that inevitably demeans and trivializes the absent Anisalan. Yeah. You need a dictionary for that one. And basically, it says everybody tries to read too much into things. And Krakauer just has a gifted way of delivering. And so he really does defend him throughout the whole book. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. He feels for the kid, as we've talked about. And lastly, as the man that, again, Krakauer did not go to the bus alone. He did take a map, but he also took an expert of the Alaska, a college professor named Roman. And Roman said, sure, he screwed up. This is on 185. But I admire what he was trying to do. Living completely off the land like that month after month is incredibly difficult. I've never done it, and I bet you that very few, if any, of the people who call McCandless incompetent have ever done it either. And like he says at the end, I guess I just can't help identifying with the guy. So he has that compassion too. And that takes us to the end here, right? As we wrap up, there'll be one more video to follow on chapter 18 and the epilogue. Happy trails.